Alright, hi everyone, and thank you for choosing to listen to this webinar. So this is the final webinar in a series of 8 webinars. This webinar focuses mostly on your final unit, which is the TAE ASS 403 unit of competency. Today's topic is therefore effectively validating assessment systems, so that's what we're going to be talking about today. Now, this particular unit is one of the units that had been updated since the previous version, so this isn't going to be the longest webinar, but there is still a lot of information that's going to be contained in it. There's lots of reasons why the unit was updated in the first place. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk a lot about why the updates have come through based on new industry practice and, well, how we're going to effectively validate an assessment system. So let's get to it. Alright, so pretty straightforward. There's 3 learning objectives. So firstly, we are going to look at how we can prepare for validation. So we're going to get all of our materials together for a validation. We're going to look at participating in the validation of assessment tools, so what's actually going to be carried out during a validation. And then we're also going to be looking at contributing to validation outcomes. Alright, so before we dive into that, like I mentioned just before, this is one of the units that was updated from the previous version of the qualification. So the first unit that was updated was the TAE ASS 401, which was discussed in the previous webinar, and this is the second unit. Both significant changes came from the need to enhance the quality of assessment in the vet sector. As was discussed in the previous webinar, the vet sector has undergone some major changes. Namely, they have identified that the quality of assessment tools has reduced in recent times, which, as we discussed, can have a long-lasting negative effect on the Australian workforce. So what does this actually mean for you? It means that not only would you have to create multiple high-quality assessment tools in the assessment cluster, but now you also need to conduct multiple validations on various components of the assessment system. The more practice you get at validating an assessment system, the higher the quality of the assessment tools will be. So there was a quality issue within industry that assessment tools were being used which weren't actually meeting compliance requirements, hence why this is a unit which has beefed up some of its requirements in recent times. So we're going to explore how to go through a validation. We'll go through a validation with how industry wants us to go through validation. So we'll move on from there. Okay, so why do we validate? So as you can see, there's several reasons why we do validate. The need for conducting validation stands out as one of the most important things within a training and assessment system. You can have all the quality assessment tools you want. You can have all the best systems, policies, and procedures, but at the end of the day, you need to do some sort of validation. So when you were looking at validation, kind of think of it as like quality control. We're basically reviewing and analyzing and then improving on the quality aspects of all our materials, process, procedures, you name it. Okay, so as a training organization, as you can see on the screen, these are the points that you'll need to adhere to. So looking at there, you're looking at reviewing assessment procedures. You're also looking at reviewing assessment tools in accordance with the rules of evidence and principles of assessment. You've probably heard all about the rules of evidence and principles of assessment 100 times by now. They are part of the standards, so they are pretty important, so we're not harping on about them just for fun. They are very important when it comes to being a trainer and assessor. You need to look at how assessment decisions are justified. So not only reviewing the quality of the tools itself, but you're also looking at the quality of the training system, and the training system can be the procedures or the trainer's competence itself. You can also look at whether learners have enough instructions to complete assessments. So we're just going to go into each of these in a little bit more detail. So let's look at review procedures. For example, with RPL, here's some questions you might ask yourself. Are the timelines you set up for providing evidence fair? Have you experienced any issues recently regarding the procedures? Have learners provided feedback on the procedure? When you're looking at the principle of assessment, You're asking yourself, are the assessment tools valid, reliable, flexible, and fair? How could you improve your tools to ensure these principles are met? Are your instructions adequate, and do they make sense? Is the assessment tool free of grammatical errors? Are the instructions unambiguous? When you're looking at the rules of evidence, you're asking yourself, do the assessment tools promote learners in submitting evidence that is valid, authentic, current, and sufficient? Have you experienced issues with learners' evidence, and how might you overcome these issues? When you're talking about reviewing whether assessment decisions are justified, you ask yourself, do the assessor guides and mapping matrices comply with industry requirements? Are trainers assessing differently? Why? And what could be done to stop this? Does the RTO moderate trainers' decisions? Are benchmarks too lenient, or are they too strict? Are they too ambiguous? When you're looking at whether learners have enough instructions, so do they have adequate information? Are there certain components in the assessment tool learners are experiencing difficulty with? Could there be issues with the learning resources you have provided the learners? Is the content consistent with the organization's training assessment strategy? Is it in line with the AQF level? Does the learning resource require more information? Does it require slight change? These are some of the questions that you'll need to be asking yourself when you're reviewing an assessment system. Overall, as you can probably tell, you're just getting the finer points ready. You're looking for the quality, and you're also looking to make sure that your assessment system is compliant. Not only just compliant as well, but are they easy for the learners to use? I mean, you can have instruments which cover all the competency standards, but learners might not even know what is going on with some of these tools. So they need to be compliant as well as user-friendly. So again, we're talking about quality. You can see there, why do we validate? Well, no assessment tool, procedure, decision, resource, etc. is perfect. Nothing's perfect. The whole point of continuous improvement processes is because things continuously change. Industry changes, terminology changes, technology changes. Everything is changing and updating, and you can look at the same tool 100 times and think it's the best thing, but you might get someone else coming through and saying, hey, why can't we include this? Or I'm starting to get a lot of learners experiencing this, this, and this. Is it possible to include this additional instructions in? Just think of it like that. If ever you're conducting a validation session and you don't find any errors or any improvements, maybe just slow down a bit, and because there's probably something you can improve on it, okay? If you're looking at the first developed set of assessment tools and it's perfect, they're not. So there will always be a way in which you can modify the validated items for continuous improvement. The change might be minor, but the theory is that anything can be improved. So we spoke about that. If you think things are flawless, keep in mind that there are external changes such as industry, even legislation. Updates within the organization and procedures can also influence your validations. A good example of this is from 1991 through to 2011, workplaces must have complied with the Occupational Health and Safety Act. During 2011, this act was updated to the Work Health and Safety Act. Most notably was terminology changes from occupational to work, which also brought numerous other changes to the WHS industry. Due to the changes in legislation, RTOs offering the certificate for an occupational health and safety would have needed to validate their documents to ensure it complies with new legislation, and also validating to ensure it complies with new training requirements, because it's now work health and safety, not occupational health and safety. So the world is always changing. You can't stay in the past. You've got to keep moving forward. It's continuous improvement 101. So when you're preparing for a validation, you can focus on a particular item, such as just the mapping matrix. However, it is good practice to validate all of the documents relating to one unit at the same time. This means preparing assessment processes, methods, and products for validation. The materials you would bring to the validation session might include the assessment tool, the instructions, the mapping matrix, the training and assessment strategy, the session plans, PowerPoint presentations, assessor guides, training package information, industry feedback, completed assessments, and the list goes on, because almost anything you can think of that an RTO develops which can be used to improve upon the RTO's assessment practices can be used when you're conducting a validation activity. So they're the three main things we're looking when we validate are the processes, the methods, and the products. All right, so when should you even organize a validation session for your resources? Well, this would usually be identified within a training assessment strategy and would also need to comply with your organizational requirements. There is actual legislation dictating when you should validate, which we'll talk about in a few slides, but just some other information regarding when to validate. You should probably look at validating your documents at least every 12 months. However, biannual validations are also conducted in some RTOs. Sometimes, such as the work health and safety example provided before, a validation will need to occur sooner rather than later to ensure that all the resources are up to date with industry, organizational, and legislative requirements. So when you conduct your validations will most likely depend on your organization's validation system, process, and procedures. All right, so we spoke about legislation. Within the standards for RTOs 2015, there's 3 primary clauses which regard validations, as you can see on the screen there. So firstly, an RTO must plan for systematic validations to occur. As mentioned just before, this would usually be identified in the relevant training assessment strategy, which needs to outline when assessment validation will occur, which training products will be the focus of the validation, who will lead and participate in validation activities, and how the outcomes of these activities will be documented and acted upon. So the validations need to be systematic. You can't just wake up one morning and go, I want to do validations. No, you kind of have to have it planned well in advance. The next clause follows on from the previous slide as well. So conducting annual validations, it's not a legal requirement. However, validating training products every 5 years is a legal requirement. This 5-year cycle would usually begin from the time the qualification is on your RTO scope of training and assessment. Further, 50% of all of your training products must be validated within the first 3 years of the 5-year cycle. It might be simply easier to conduct annual validations of your documents to demonstrate compliance with ASQA and also for continuous improvement purposes. Clause 1.1 identifies the need for validations to involve individuals not directly related to the training product. This could mean internally, where a trainer who teaches a different qualification is involved with the validation. You can also include external personnel in your validation sessions, however this might incur additional costs. Validation may be undertaken through a team approach, where collectively, team members hold the required qualifications, skills, and knowledge. Trainers and assessors can be involved in validation activities as long as they were not directly involved in the particular instance of delivery and assessment of the training product being validated. Okay, so I'll just say that again. Trainers and assessors can be involved in validation activities as long as they were not directly involved in the particular instance of delivery and assessment of the training product being validated. So it's basically just trying to ensure that the learning materials and the processes and reviewing the assessment decisions isn't biased. If you were a trainer for a qualification and you were validating your own assessment decisions, well, of course you're going to think that all your decisions are perfect. So just to reduce some bias there. A validation should occur with multiple people involved. Validating your own training resources without other individuals can lead to biases and other ethical issues. Validations usually occur in a meeting format and involve the following steps. So step 1 is preparation. Getting together all of the required materials and determining the reason, focus, and purpose of the validation. The second step is interpreting the assessment methods and instruments. What do the materials mean, and where do they fit into the overall context of the assessment? The third step is becoming involved in the assessment validation itself. The trainer or assessor will often be involved in the assessment panel or asked to provide recommendations based on their experience and knowledge. The fourth step is discussing the findings. What was suggested? What improvements can be made? How can the quality of the assessment methods and instruments be improved? And the fifth step is implementing and making improvements based on what was suggested and discussed. So if you follow those 5 steps, that's the key to an efficient validation. Be prepared, make sure everyone's on the same page, actually discuss instead of nodding your head and going, yep, I agree. Some quality discussion is necessary, and then at the end of the day, actually implementing the proposed changes. And what's the point of validation if you're not actually going to make any changes? Alright, so that's how you can organize an efficient validation, but here's how to make it more effective. So, before attending a validation session, you should be made aware of what training documents will be validated. As such, you should be prepared to contribute and participate in assessment validation by preparing reports, ideas, suggestions, and recommendations for improvement. The validation session is a collaborative activity, one in which should be documented accordingly, most likely recorded using meeting minutes, but also could be audio recorded. It would be a shame if one of your suggestions was not recorded and forgotten down the track. Depending on the reason for validation, you might need to allow for a larger time frame for contributing to and closing the validation session. Validations can be quick, but some can last hours. If your assessment procedures, policies, training materials, and other associated documents are of a high standard to begin with, you shouldn't run into these troubles at all. Likewise, conducting annual validations might mean shorter validation sessions, as it is unlikely for external changes, such as legislative changes, to be implemented. During a validation session, not only should you provide your own suggestions for improvement, but also actively listen and understand other attendees' reasoning with their ideas and suggestions. In a perfect world, everyone will have the same ideas and all unanimously agree on decisions, but in reality it can be difficult to make decisions if there are disagreements during the validation. For example, pretend that another trainer has brought evidence to the validation session that one particular question with an assessment tool had a low satisfactory rate, and deemed that the question was ambiguous and not enough content was detailed in the relevant learning materials. The training manager, who has also attended the validation session, they might disagree and suggest that if content was included in the learning materials, then we are practically giving them the answer. Discussions might go back and forth, and a compromise might be made to suggest to learners to conduct their own research on certain topics. The discussions in your validations should refer back to the principles of assessment and rules of evidence. These principles and rules are an important component of conducting a validation, as on the surface, a suggestion might appear good, but might not adhere to the principles of assessment or rules of evidence. To ensure you have all areas covered, your RTO might have developed a validation checklist or a validation template. Now, you should have access to a validation checklist within your supporting resources. This is what you'll be using within your project, so you're going to have to use it. You'll see there's quite a lot of evidence items on there, and you're basically just going through the list and just making your comments as you go. So once the validation session is complete, the outcomes of the validation will need to be recorded. In particular, the suggestions which were agreed upon will require an action plan outlining what changes are needed, who will do it, and before when. When changes are being made, you will need to update your training documents in accordance with your organization's version control procedures. Essentially, you need to archive older versions of training documents and ensure you are always using the most current version. This can be as simple as adding in a different version number. You might have noticed that on all of these webinars there's a version number, and this is identified for a reason. After the changes have been made, you should review and monitor the changes made. Do the changes pass quality control? Are the changes effective? Do the changes overcome the issues identified during the assessment validation session? If not, perhaps further action is required. Okay, so in a nutshell, assessment validation, it's fairly self-explanatory. It's just quality control. A lot of the time, RTOs will have their own validation checklists, systems, policies, and procedures You might be called to do or participate within a validation activity. And quite frankly, if you can take a lot of this information on board, this will definitely help you when you're partaking in these validation activities. So, it's an open room. Your suggestions should be listened to. You should listen to other people's suggestions. There's a lot of documentation to review when you're within assessment validation, because the aim is quality. That is what industry wants. That is what the government wants. That is what everyone wants, really. That's what trainers, students, managers, we just want high quality assessments so that we can all be proud of the materials we offer to our students. Alright, so you're probably wondering now, what do you actually need to do for your project? So, as you can see there, for your project, you'll need to conduct and participate in 3 different validation sessions with at least 1 participant, where all the validations are based on different sets of assessment tools. So the validation activity has to be conducted with another real person, and there'll be 3 different sets of assessment tools where you will be reviewing and validating. So we spoke about what documents to prepare for an assessment validation. These should all be prepared for you. You just need to access them, and then with your participant, you're just critically analyzing all of the materials in there. Is the instructions clear? Do the assessments meet the compliance requirements? And thankfully, a lot of these questions are outlined on the assessment validation checklist. They're very specific, and like I mentioned, there's probably about 30 plus different questions which cover all facets of an assessment validation system which you need to know about. So when you're completing project 1, this is what you need to submit. So evidence of conducting the 3 different validation sessions, whether that's through, look at the different ways you can submit evidence for that, and you also need to send through evidence of completing the assessment validations by using the checklists. So again, that's the 30 or so questions which run through the assessment validation process. Okay, I've always found this particular unit to be a nice one to finish on. It is thankfully very short. It's very easy to understand compared to a lot of other training assessment components, but this is probably one of the most important units to grasp. And if you just have in the back of your mind, it's all about quality, it's about compliance, and it's about giving the learners the best student experience possible, if you follow the checklist and the procedures, you really can't run into too many problems. So this is a fairly short session, so thank you for listening. If you have any questions about it, you can call the office on 1300 737 006, or you can email the office or your trainer, or you can even email trainer@ilec.edu.au. So again, thanks for listening in, and hope everyone finds completing this assessment a breeze.